I'm Carolivia Herron, Carolivia. Herron is Herron.
Great. And do you have a professional title you like to go by
I
or
prefer
position?
professor. Yes.
Right. So tell me a little bit about the picture you're holding in your hand right now.
This is a picture of my great grandmother, Rowena Nelson Lumpkins, and it was passed down to me by an aunt. She was buried at Harmony Cemetery in, I don't know, 1940s, something like that, 30s. She was born enslaved in Virginia in 1858, and she had the nickname Bon Bon. She was considered very beautiful. I think it was Bon Bon, it's from beautiful, the French. And it's really sad for me that her grave, along with the grave of my infant brother, I don't have a picture of him because he died as a baby and they didn't want pictures of him. But my mother decided to bury my brother on top of him, essentially 3 feet above where she was. And the two of them were buried in Harmony Cemetery. My mother told me that she got some kind of a notice that they were being moved somewhere, and she never remembered anything else about it. And the next thing she knew, they were developing that site into shopping centers then, as far as I know. And I was stunned when I saw in the paper in 2020, I believe, the gravestones were found in Virginia. My great grandmother ran away from slavery. Well, she was a baby. She was only 2 years old in 1860, so she couldn't have run away on her own. But she was helped to run away before the Civil War was over. She was in Massachusetts, and spent her life getting away from Virginia. And the idea of her being back in Virginia is very, very painful after her trying to escape.
Do you remember visiting Columbia Harmony Cemetery?
Yes, I visited it with my mother when my infant brother died. And I actually have a chapter in one of my novels about walking up and down the cemetery and learning new words, because people had left flowers there, and I was learning colors. And actually, that may be where I started to like purple so much. It was lavender. I didn't know the word lavender. I was only 3 when he died, and I would say red flower, pink, yellow flower. I was repeating words to myself, and then I was taught the word lavender at that graveyard. And my mother would go there grieving for him and take me with her for I would say a year or so after his death, until actually one of the caretakers asked her, in kindness, not in meanness, don't bring that little girl out here living in a graveyard all the time. Just try to find something else to do. Some people will say it's officious and sexist, but I think he was just trying to be kind, and thought about me, in fact. And my mother replaced going to the graveyard to going down to the National Mall, and perhaps part of my love of Washington, D.C. stemmed from that. But I do remember walking up and down, my mother sitting there grieving and grieving and grieving.
And was it told to you and your family that the bodies were relocated to New Harmony?
She said she got a letter about them trying to relocate, but that was told to me many, many years later. I was the one that kept asking the questions. As you can imagine, I was very distressed over the death of my brother. It was almost the very first memory of my life, and very loving parents. And the first time I ever felt alone in my life was when standing over the cradle, and my mother screamed a scream I've never heard to this day. My ear, psychologically, I guess I blocked it out. She started to fall. My father ran in and caught her as she fell. And I was there standing by myself alone. And so I kept asking questions about it, but they wouldn't tell me because they were, I guess they didn't understand that I needed to know. And they kept trying to hide from me what was happening. So it wasn't until I was a teenager that she finally told me they were buried together. But I do remember, long before that, I lived in, there were 2 different apartments when I was a kid. I was in Mayfair Mansions, and we were still in the first apartment. That means that was before I was 8. She told me that she had received a letter about moving the bodies of her grandmother. And she didn't mention my brother. She just said it was her grandmother, which it is.
And from that point on, was there a place that you guys were able to go once that letter came to pay respect in a physical way? Or
No, it's been the great grief of my whole life. That there's no grief greater than that. My mother and father would have to speak for themselves about what was their great grief, but to me it was driving me crazy. And every September 30th, which is his death day, I would get distressed and walk the streets and where can I go? And finally, when I learned where Harmony was, because my mother I didn't even know where. I knew that there were Harmony, but I didn't know where it was. But it was under the Brookland Metro. So sometimes I would just take a ride down to the Brookline Metro and just sit there and grieve for him, sitting there in the metro station.
yes, I can imagine it's been so hard for so many families that it's like you had a place to pay respect and it was taken.
It was just gone, yes.
And then I think it's fascinating that the Metro was still beneath that, was still kind of this hollow ground, this sacred ground.
And still, yes, and still is for me. It still is. The Brookline Metro has a special place because that's where I go to think about my brother. I never knew my great grandmother, even though I knew some stories about her. But I was actually the first person to see my brother dead. I was the one who discovered the little blue body in the cradle. At 3 years old, and it is the event of my life, if you will. I remember when my father was holding my mother. My mother had her mouth open and screaming. I walked to the window. My memory is that I walked to the window and picked up an orange crayon and started writing on the window. And turns out, after many years of thinking back and piecing it through, that there was about a 6-month delay between me actually, the actual death of the brother, and me actually writing. And I learned to, I guess I taught myself to write from looking at picture books. And people learned that I could write before they knew that I could read. They didn't know. And I didn't know either. I think of words as pictures. I remember I wrote the word rain, R-A-I-N. And I thought that was a picture of rain. I didn't make the connection that they were letters.
Beautiful. Now you've gone on to have a very prestigious career as an author, as a professor. Tell me a little bit about your work as a professor and really what you specialize in.
Well, I love epics. Epic literary genre is my basic field, and that also goes all the way back to my little baby brother. I found joy in reading and in writing, and I used to pray every night that I could be a writer when I grow up, and I told God, if I couldn't be a writer, just let me die, let me out of here. But I also prayed that my mother would never have to bury another child. So when I got to 10 years old and I wasn't sure I was going to be a writer, I wanted to die, but then I realized I couldn't die because then I would break my other prayer, that she didn't have to bury another child. And so I remember standing up. I didn't know that, thank goodness I didn't know you had to do something to die. I just lay down on the floor, thought you could die. I didn't know better. And I got up off the floor and I decided to trust it, that I would be a writer, because I didn't want my mother to bury another one of her children. And within a year, I discovered Paradise Lost, John Milton's Paradise Lost, in the library. And I didn't know the word epic then, but I knew that I'd found my answer to whatever it is I was asking in that book. That was just going into junior high school, 7th grade. I was 11. And then the following year in ancient history, we talked about the ancient wars, the Trojan War, which I was teaching this morning. And when I read the Iliad for the class, you can imagine this poor teacher. I guess he'd been teaching history for ages and ages, and nobody had ever asked him a question. I was, as usual, not paying attention and reading another book under the table. But the story about Achilles and Hector and all got to me, and Helen and so forth. And I raised my hand and I said, "Has anybody ever written a book about it?" And he looked like he'd been waiting for that question all his life. And he erased all the blackboard and wrote up on the board, Homer, comma, the Iliad. And he asked me if I would do a book report on it. And I did a book report on the Iliad in the 8th grade. And that was my field. And I loved epics from the beginning. And I wanted to teach them, write them, learn them, share them, create them, find them. And I guess I see epics going everywhere. I feel like I walk with the characters in the epics all the time. So I went to Howard University for 2 years until we shut it down. Those were the 60s. I knew Stokely Carmichael. He and I were in the same class, and he stayed there and fought it out, but I transferred to Eastern Baptist College, which then became Eastern University, and loved epics there, and went on to Villanova. Between Villanova and University of Pennsylvania, the PhD, I went off to write my novel, Thereafter Johnny, the first novel. I also had an attraction for Judaism from early years. I would say from 5 years old. Some of my stories recount that. I grew up in the Baptist church. My mother is Baptist, and when I was about 9 years old, my father's mother. This is my maternal line right here. But on my father's side, the paternal line has Jewish heritage. And I met my great-grandmother on that side of the family. And her name is Olivia. That's where the Always an Olivia comes from, my middle name. I was born Carol Olivia, but I actually had it changed formally, legally, to Carolivia now. And turns out that the name Olivia, or its Hebrew form, Shulamit, has been in my family going back 500 years to the Inquisition, and being kicked out of Spain and Portugal, and going from there to Italy, then North Africa, and to the Georgia Sea Islands and the Geechees and so forth. I've gotten way off your topic. You asked me about.
Well, no, but it's all great. And reading your book, Olivia, I've got a lot of friends in the Gullah Geechee community in St. Helena, and
Yes.
I was really excited to read that your connection to that community.
Yes, I'm a Geechee, and I didn't know. My mother used to call my father and me Geechees. I thought it was just like saying sugar plum or cutie, or I didn't know that it was a real group of people until much later. And I knew she never called herself a Geechee because she's not from that area. But my father and I have that heritage. So after I went to Europe to finish my novel, Thereafter Johnny, that's when I realized that the next novel I wanted to write was essentially a distillation of sorts of many of the epics that I loved. So I decided, well, why not let somebody else pay for it while I researched my novel? So that's when I went to the University of Pennsylvania and got a master's in creative writing and a PhD in epic literary genre and comparative literature, but essentially the epic literary genre, and from there. Mm-hmm.
And now you've also been professor at Howard.
Yes. Well, I actually thought I had retired from being a professor in 2005. Before I got to Howard, I went from Penn to Mexico for a year for a Fulbright, and from there I taught at Harvard University for several years. I stayed there as a junior professor for 4 or 5 years, and then I went to the School of Education, the Divinity School, and I spent a year at Hebrew College, and working on various topics that were intriguing to me. I went to Brandeis as well for a year. So and then I went from Harvard to Mount Holyoke College, and then to California. I was trying to create an online multimedia epic, and I needed a computer lab to do that. And they offered me that at California State University at Chico, and that's where I went. But that's when my book, Nappy Hair, hit the press, and I was being banned all over the country and hit the bestseller list.
Yeah.
And so things changed after that.
Well, it's
I don't mean to interrupt you. You could put your picture down, because I'm getting a little rubbing noise
Okay.
from the.
Is that okay?
Yeah, because when you're talking.
Yeah, move it around, yeah.
Perfect.
Sorry.
We'll have you hold it up again.
No problem, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
It's a beautiful book and beautifully written, and it has such a great cadence to it. What was the controversy behind Nappy Hair?
Oh, the Nappy Hair book controversy, many people felt that I was exposing black secrets and I shouldn't tell white people about it. There are three basic reasons why it was a problem. First of all, that the visuals in there made an assumption that the person with the nappiest hair in the world also has the darkest skin. And those of us who are African American know that's not true, that I have the nappiest hair. Right now, I can tell you white hair is straight this is straight compared to how my hair used to be. This is like having straight hair, but I don't have the darkest skin. And it was a misunderstanding of the people who are not a part of the culture. And not to say that they couldn't have learned, but they didn't in this case, and that was a problem. And there was a problem in the coloration of the skin. They're, especially old folks, I guess I'm one of them now, get really upset when the palms of the hands are black, the same color. The palms of the hands are lighter color than the back, and several things like that with the visuals. Some people use the word nappy as an insult, which was not used in my family that way. My father really loved African culture, African American culture, and of course he knew I had the nappiest hair in the world, and he used to make up stories about how wonderful it is. I remember coming home from school telling him that in 8th grade or something, the science teacher said that the more curlicues you have in your brain, the higher your intelligence. And he said, well, yeah, because your mind just kept going right on through the skull and came out in my hair. You know, things like that, very self-affirming. But many people in the African American community use nappy as an insult, and I didn't really know that. And
It's a beautiful book, and it stood the test.
well, it's there. Yes, I had actually thought that it would go out of style and I would redo it, but that didn't happen because people keep buying it, and I keep, thank goodness, getting checks in my bank account for it.
Going back to Howard University, especially one of the focuses of what we're doing is telling the story about the DC area, going back to when Columbia Harmony opened and to when it was unfortunately removed. How did Howard University really just play a part in this community, this city, historically?
Well, I have to talk about that. I'm sorry, I stopped at Chico, so thank you for bringing me back. I was born at Howard University, first of all. My mother and I met at Freedman's Hospital 75 years ago this month, and that was where we all were born in my community. It was Freedman's Hospital then, and now it's Howard University Hospital. And Howard University is a powerhouse in a very interesting way that I didn't really discover until I was away and came back. And that if you have somebody in your family, if you're a DC African American family, and there's somebody in your family that really, really can't put up with the way white people act, you get a job at Howard. So there's still mean people and awful people as well as wonderful people, but at least they're black people, you know. And there was, so we have several members of our family who got jobs at Howard, at various levels, because they didn't have, that way they didn't have to deal with the government service, which is where most people went. They went for the U.S. government, federal government. My mother was a school teacher and went to Minor Teachers College, which is right on the Howard campus. And my parents met across the street from Howard at the Banneker playground. She was playing tennis. And say, hey, you know, hey baby, what's your name, kind of thing. And that's the beginning of my own interconnection, my own life. And Howard is truly a center. They call it the Becca now. They didn't call it that then, but it was a place where you really could be judged on the content of your character, rather than the color of your skin. You could just go there and be. And I find that many of my students now, I didn't mention that I thought I had retired, but then this job came open in classics at Howard University about 5 years ago. And I couldn't resist it because I actually had never taught predominantly African American students before, and I couldn't resist. So I came out of retirement to apply and got the job. And it's so strange to me that most of my students come from predominantly white institutions. They're African Americans from predominantly white institutions, and they want to be judged by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. So it's the odd position of going to a black university in order not to be judged because you're black. You're judged by the same criteria that anyone is in all other contexts, I hope. So.
And what would this community have been like, especially around Columbia Harris Cemetery, going back 70 years, going back 80 years? What would this have, this was a large African American community, just DC in general. And I mean, that was
so
such a large cemetery. Before they moved it, it was such a big part of the community.
Realize I was too young to know of it in that way. I was 3 and 4 years old when I was walking through Harmony Cemetery. And I have some images in my head. I'm not sure. Sometimes I know I was there because I can remember the man who told my mother not to come back anymore, to take me somewhere else and all that. I can remember my mother grieving. But I had no idea of its size. That's late coming to my consciousness. I just wanted to find the grave of my brother and to grieve over it. And then when I found out that my great-grandmother was there too, and I'd heard stories about her and her escape from the South, or at least the person who brought her from the South to Massachusetts, and our connection with the Wampanoag people in Massachusetts, part of our heritage as well. I just wanted a place. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for that, because I don't understand how they could just dig up people and throw them away like that. How could they do it?
Well, certainly I think a lot of, like, what we're looking at is corruption and changing demographics. How have you seen Washington, D.C. transform over the past, over your lifetime?
Well, transformed greatly, of course. I was one of the families used to blockbust my neighborhood. You know what blockbusting is? Blockbusting is when the real estate folks decide that they're going to change their community from white to black. So they scare the white people and tell them that, black people are coming and the property values are going to go down. And they find a black family and they pick a house in the middle of the block and they get the white people to sell low, they get the black people to buy high, they make all the money, and there's white flight following the road outside. I have to say that in this community was quite something different happened in an organization called Neighbors Incorporated, and that they welcomed us into the community. Blacks and whites came to our house. And this synagogue where we are right now was a part of that. Tifereth Israel, Rabbi Abramowitz, and others really helped to make me feel comfortable. I remember sitting on the sofa in my house and wondering why white people were so mean and nasty. I said, all we did was move it. They act like you go up to the Safeway and you buy a banana like you're not supposed to eat or something. Like, what is wrong with these people? And I was sitting there feeling so terrible and deciding what kind of life this is. And there was a knock on the door. I was in high school, and it was Marvin Kaplan, and he's a white Jewish man, and there was a white woman and a black man and a black woman. I don't know who the others were. Marvin Kaplan I know because he was a member of this synagogue, and I got to know him later. And he was the president of Neighbors Incorporated and came to welcome us to the community. And they would go and convince the white people that the world wasn't coming to an end. They would come and welcome my family and others like me into the community. And it really is a case of the right thing at the right time. But not all communities were like that. And it wasn't successful everywhere. It was successful in the Tacoma area and in Shepherd Park, we're in Shepherd Park right now. But it wasn't as successful in Brightwood and Manor Park, which are close neighborhoods. But still a change. drastic change. We couldn't come north of Florida Avenue except to go to Howard. I don't know how well you know the city, so.
No, we're both from
Yeah,
New York.
yeah. Well, Florida Avenue used to be the boundary where black people were allowed, and then Howard University was built north of that. So you could go north to go to Howard, and that sort of thing. And then slowly, over time, the rest of the city became African American, for the most part. And now, of course, the change is coming another way. There are only two of us on my block now of my generation who've kept our parents, or keeping our parents' house, I should say. My mother's still living. She's 97 years old, so we're there together. And 3 doors down is Roger, and two of us are like the old guard, I guess, and everything else is changing.
Wow, amazing. And in terms of Judaism and African American Judaism, and just historically, this being, we have a lot of other churches and forms of worship. Any thoughts on that, just historically, and certainly why it is important to you?
Certainly, I can take that back as well to my infant brother. You see how everything starts with that. And I get along very well with my mother and with the Christian community, so I don't want it to sound like a put down in any way at all. But there is a tendency in the community I was in before I became Jewish to say, when something grievous has happened to you, to try to forget it, try to forget it, try to forget it. And that was driving me crazy. Indeed, it did drive me crazy. I've been in psychiatric units. And now that I'm 75 years old, I don't mind saying things that I used to be ashamed of. That's over now. You can't hurt me anymore. But what I found in Judaism, the first thing they did was say, remember, remember, remember. They didn't say forget. They said remember. And that alone gave me the relief, so that now on my brother's yard site, the anniversary of his death, I can come with a group of people and remember, and stand up and on purpose remember. And it seemed like half of my insanity, or all of it even, just dissipated from me, trying to get over this death for so long. And it finally, at least in that one aspect. Of course, that's not the only reason for being attracted to Judaism, but I always felt like I didn't want anything between me and God. And I can understand that other people may want a Jesus between them and God. That's fine, but I don't want that. And even in Judaism, there's a passage in the Torah where the Hebrew people asked Moses to stand between them and God. Well, I disagree with that too. I don't want anybody between me and God. I want to be there.
Is there a large African American Jewish population in D.C.?
Large. Certainly every community has African American Jews of color. They come from so many different I say not organizations, countries and cultures. I certainly found some in when I lived in New Mexico. I left out the whole New Mexico experiment, and I know some Jews from Asia. There's some from Africa here. I'm very close to the community in Africa, in several countries of Africa, including Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Uganda in particular. For many years, I ran a program here to help the community there, and I still do that on my own in various ways. And in South Africa, Zimbabwe, I've had, but that's around the world. This synagogue, I heard, was known as the synagogue where everybody has adopted black children. I heard that when I was traveling around in other synagogues. I wish there were. Quite frankly, I wish there were more, but the ones I do know. During COVID, nobody comes anymore, including me. I'm on Zoom, and now that we've moved from Zoom to, is it Facebook or something like that? It's like you can't even communicate. It's kind of rough. But it's certainly less than 10%, 5% maybe. I don't know.